Where do you start when you want to integrate livestock as a farmer? Many would say poultry. We've all seen the Joao Salatin or Richard Perkins style chicken caravans, and if you haven't, Google them. Eggs and chicken meat are a great, fast, cash flow generating enterprise. But there are a lot of issues. From lockdowns because of bird flu to feed, because these aren't ruminants, so they cannot just graze. And another big one, genetics. We've bred birds to be either egg or meat birds, and that's incredibly inefficient and horrible for animal welfare. So today we have two poultry experts joining us who are embarking on a mission to answer the question, what does it mean to produce deeply regenerative chicken and eggs?
This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, investing as if the planet mattered, where we talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land and our sea, grow our food, what we eat, where and consume. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. To make it easy for fans to support our work, we launched our membership community, and so many of you have joined us as a member. Thank you. If our work created value for you, and if you have the means, and only if you have the means, consider joining us. Find out more on gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag. That is gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag, or find the link below.
Welcome to another episode, today with an expert in poultry welfare and behavior and a regen transition pioneer in the UK. Welcome Annie and Clare. And we're going to talk a lot about poultry and really unpacking the role of chickens in our agriculture system, how it grew into this massive industry that has nothing to do with regen and what it could turn into, maybe potentially, because it's not such an easy let's say animal to integrate, as we'll discover. But I'd love to start with a personal question to both of you. You can decide who takes it first, and to learn a bit more about your background and to ask specifically, how come you spend most of your awake hours to think about regenerative agriculture and food, and specifically poultry? What led you to, there are many other easier things to do in life than reimagining chicken in agriculture. What led you, both of you, to this path or to this place?
That's interesting. So my love of poultry came first before my love of regen, I think. And it started when I went on my placement from university, and I knew absolutely nothing about poultry. And in fact, I was scared of chickens. I didn't even like them. But I went to this amazing farm that Ruth Layton and Roland Bonney were running, and I saw what they were explaining about how a food system could be different, and using poultry as a way of explaining that. And so I just kind of fell in love with what they were trying to do. So I found myself becoming a poultry farm worker for a year through my placement year, and looking after chickens, and something I never imagined doing. But that's when I realized then how interesting they were, and the whole food industry around chicken and eggs was. And that's where it started for me on the chicken side. On the regen side, it's kind of like fast forward almost not quite 20 years, but was then it was water. Like often people say that, don't they? Like Gabe Brown, I think, says it's the water that gets people. And it was after we were lambing. It was after I was back on the same farm as where my love of poultry started. A whole career off through the industry, working in retail, working with on poultry, both on the welfare side, but also development groups with farmers. And I found myself back on the same farm, but lambing this time. And we'd had the wettest winter on record. Everything was underwater. And we were lambing. At the beginning of lambing, it was a nightmare. And by the end of lambing, there were cracks in the ground. And I was just stood there like, where has all the water gone? I just don't know where it's gone. And then it was a little after that we started doing infiltration rates and testing, and we did the first infiltration rates on a field that had been permanent pasture for 20 years in an old parkland, and it took something like between 40 minutes and 9 hours or something for the 2 inches of water to infiltrate into the soil. And I was like, right, that's where all the water's gone. It's not gone anywhere in, it's all run off. None of it soaked in. And that was like, that's where I think that was one of the points where it kind of unlocked it for me, as far as we need to do it differently. And that was because things were getting harder. Every year was feeling harder. In kind of conventional farming terms, it just didn't feel like it ever got any easier, and it felt like, if it keeps getting harder like this, I don't know if I can do this for much longer. And then I realized that, and then it all started to unravel the other way.
Fascinating that the water, I mean, I've heard it multiple times. I'm reflecting on it now, but I think more on the farmer side and inflection moments, light bulb moments, whatever we want to call it, often have to do with water and drought or the cycle, or maybe fire as well. I think on people that are not on farm, it's just not so visible unless it's like a flood that comes through your town. So it's an answer we've had before, but not so much from the people that are not intimately on the land, for good reasons, probably. I mean, you notice when it's very hot and warm and maybe you have a garden, etc., or when it's extremely wet, but somehow you don't really process that, I think. But I think, of course, if you're managing the land daily, you will really notice the difference between way too wet and cracks in the ground immediately. It's interesting how water keeps coming back. Obviously, like, it depends, sunlight and water and soil. That's sort of the cycle we have and we have to work with. But it would be good probably if people not on the land would notice that a bit more. Sorry, I got an tangent. Anyway, welcome to the podcast. And what about your journey into becoming one of the leading experts on poultry welfare, behavior, and you went really deep on the poultry side, and didn't give up. Let's say, didn't step away and said, okay, I will never touch anything with chickens again. No, you decided to dig even deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess similarly, my regenerative journey, started the chicken side of things started much earlier. So I did my undergraduate was actually in animal behaviour and welfare, and then as a graduate went to work with the same farm as Clare in Oxford, with Ruth Layton and Roland Bonney, and kind of fell into chickens a bit accidentally. A lot of their work they had done historically had been with chickens, and they became a really interesting and fascinating livestock species to kind of further my research and understanding of the world, I guess. And what is really, I think, with the absolute numbers of chickens that are produced globally, I think my kind of maybe slightly naive approach was that actually you can have a big impact if you make a very small change to chickens globally. So that small change can result in large numbers of birds kind of gaining that benefit. So started doing research really alongside Clare. Ultimately, this is where we met as well, and then also started a PhD looking at commercial broilers, so meat chickens, and how to measure their welfare, very much through a kind of positive welfare lens, which is taking a similar approach to regenerative agriculture in that it's looking at kind of promoting positive outcomes. So I was looking at measures to measure those positive outcomes within a commercial system, which is pretty hard when there's not many positive outcomes of commercial systems. And then we started the conversion of the Oxford farm, which was very much from a beef perspective, and then eventually kind of thought a little bit about chickens, but not really nearly as deeply as we are now, and really started down that journey of what does it mean to produce chickens in a regenerative way, and where do chickens or poultry sit within a kind of regenerative farming system.
And when did you realize or decided, I mean, it might have been a journey or path, of course, that the incremental approach, or not the incremental, but the spread out approach, if billions of chickens have a slightly better life, that's a lot of impact, or like you at some point you decided I want to really go deep in what role chickens could play, but by definition that meant working with less chickens at that time. Maybe the impact would be bigger over time, but it's a very different strategy. Concentration on a few thousand chickens and see what the best could be there, or working on legislation, and you literally worked on that influenced billions of chickens and will continue to do so. When did that, it's not a flip of a switch, but when did that happen, or how did that happen?
So during COVID, we had a lot of family illness ultimately, and I think there was a realization of the amount of time that we have, and actually that making these kind of small tweaks to systems wasn't going to bring about significant change. And the kind of old, I think it's Buckminster Fuller quote around creating a new reality. You can't work within the current system. It needs to be taken out of that, and you need to be creating something completely new. So I think that was the realization is we've made some good changes, and all of the stuff that we have done in terms of getting tree cover on ranges in commercial systems and changing breeds within supply chains is really positive. But ultimately, to have a system that's really good for the world that we really need, that needs a complete redesign and a complete change of system.
So you came to that realization. What happened next? You called Clare and said, "This is the question," or "This is what was the next step?"
I think, we were working together, kind of doing little bits of consultancy, and I think it arrived at us very naturally and very gradually. I think we realised that no one was really talking about poultry, or few people were really talking about poultry within a regenerative system. We're seeing lots of people interested, but maybe not so many knowing kind of what they can do, and also kind of doing it from the chicken perspective. So I think within Regen, there's obviously a really good focus on soil, but sometimes the needs and wants of animals might be left behind a little bit, such that actually when designing a system, you obviously need to do that for the benefits of the soils and the ecosystems, but you also really need to think what a chicken needs. And that was kind of the perspective I think we could bring quite uniquely to the kind of Regen movement.
And Claire, for you, why were you ready at that time to dive into that, or to start thinking about? That's literally like the tagline of Impeccable Poultry. What does it mean to produce deeply regenerative chicken and eggs? Why were you at a moment in that time where you were receptive for that, or interested, and not just keep working with this supply chain and this? There's a lot of work to do, X, Y, Z. Why were you open to it?
Yeah, I think I think it was COVID as well. During that time, we didn't have the illness stuff, but I definitely had what COVID did was really ramp up for me that sense of urgency of, where we're heading, and that we can't keep doing this tweaking the status quo, because it's not quick enough, and it's not having the desired effect. And so part of that process for me of unpicking that was realizing that in the UK we don't have enough demonstration places for people to know, well, okay, so what do we do then? So it's not just standing on the sidelines and critiquing, but okay, so how do we do it? And so that's how
on grazing it seems to be there, right? Like it's very interesting, like the ruminant side, but how, just a few numbers, like how big is chicken in terms of diet, like just to show the neglectedness, let's say, of the chicken, the regen chicken side.
That's a great question. So as far as regenerative chicken or agroecological chicken, we're seeing a great rise in chicken tractors and that type of thing. But of the poultry industry, that will be less than 1%, significantly less than 1% of the volume that is produced. And also it's not had wide scale uptake, and that's because I think there are still some challenges around it. So when we first started the transition of the beef grazing system at the farm in Oxford, we had poultry at the time. We'd always had chickens on that farm. And what we realized was that we had these amazing organic chicken systems, but they were stationary in one place. And of course, what we started to learn about regeneration was that they needed to be moving around and integrating and not just being sort of siloed in one place. And we started to bring that about. We built a few chicken tractor, Richard Perkins design sheds ourselves, and that was great. We were moving the chickens around, and they were getting fresh grass every day. We didn't have the rat problems that you often get in chicken systems. That was amazing. But there's issues over having a fully slatted floor. That means they don't have anywhere to dust bathe when it's wet. So then you have to add that provision in. When you get bird flu, we have lockdown. We're sometimes locked down for 5-6 months a year. The shed design is not set up perfectly for that. And so it's kind of like, it was like one step forward, 2 steps back all the time. And that's why we, Annie and I, kind of in our conversations, and also taking it as well for me, it's been the building of the farm here. So how do we create a demonstration farm about the art of what's possible when it comes to agroecology and livestock farming? Because we have some great examples with like Farm Ed and Groundswell, where it's an arable farm transitioning in integrating livestock. Well, the majority of farmland in the UK by size is already under livestock management. So how do we transition that? And so we're interested in the kind of inclusion of perennials in an existing livestock system, but also diversity. This is an 80-acre farm, and the reality is, however good you are at mob grazing, you're never going to be able to generate massive, enough margin to feed everybody from this 80 acres of land. So it's so important to integrate other enterprises in, which we do with trees and perennial market garden and annuals in our market garden too. But chickens are a natural species to layer in, and particularly when you take the sort of wilding, almost that wilding theory of what would the landscape have looked like and what species would have been present.
Because why is the chicken a natural? And we'll get to where you are, but just to Annie, on the chicken side and the poultry side, why is chickens or is poultry a natural one to layer in? Why would somebody say that? And actually, it doesn't make sense. Like, what's the rationale behind that?
I think people really love chickens. They are so they're so charismatic, and actually farmers that want to add an additional enterprise that's fairly small, that is livestock, that they feel like they can manage quite easily, it's quite a natural thing to introduce. Also, people love eggs. You've got kind of direct, kind of really place-based kind of association with eggs. People like to buy eggs from a farm that they know. And then also chicken. People love to eat chicken. We've got a really insatiable appetite for chicken. In the UK, we're eating about 35 kilos of chicken per person per year, which is a lot. That's not me. So someone else is eating my 35 kilos too. So and over 200 eggs per person per year. So there's a direct kind of.
It's a massive piece of protein.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And from a chicken perspective and an ecology perspective, how good or not good is the rationale in like a farm of where you're building? What does it make sense to integrate chickens? Like, does it fit in the way you're potentially thinking in terms of? We know it's a jungle bird originally. Like, how well does it fit into a grazing operation?
Yeah, and I guess that's really part of what we want to explore. So we've called it Impeccable Poultry for the fact that actually maybe it's not even chicken at all. Maybe we should be looking towards more kind of grazing poultry, so geese or even ducks. So we're not really sure, but because we recognise we're not going to turn everyone away from this kind of need and love of chicken, actually let's start with chicken and see if we can do it in a way that is beneficial for the environment and people and all of these things. So very much part of our exploration.
And what are the big barriers or challenges with integrating? You mentioned a few on the design but what are the big ones you want to tackle or will try to tackle with Impeccable Poultry? So
the key difference, I guess, from the current kind of pasture poultry community, which are obviously all doing a really great job, is that we want to look at it from this dual purpose perspective. So at the moment we have two types of chicken. We have a chicken for meat and a chicken for laying eggs. And historically we would have had a dual purpose bird, and across a lot of the world we do have a dual purpose bird. So a lot of kind of backyard production would be a dual purpose chicken. And so we want to understand what breed is actually dual purpose as well. So dual purpose chickens really have originated as a byproduct of the egg industry and egg production generally. So when we domesticated chickens originally, it wasn't for their meat. It took quite a few, hundreds of years before we started eating them. But we were eating their eggs and then eating the cockerels as they were kind of surplus to the requirements. So part of what we want to look at is actually, we know that chicken is a good protein source, but what kind of bird makes a good dual purpose chicken that actually provides a good meat bird as well as lays eggs? So maybe coming at it from a slightly different angle to what has been done historically and is being done over in the continent in terms of the kind of ban on male chick culling. We're seeing a rise in dual purpose breeds, but again, it's to address that kind of waste stream within the laying hen industry. So not a true dual purpose bird.
Because currently the males are being culled or have to now grow up because there's legislation coming in, but of course there's a massive issue in the chicken industry with the males being born and basically be worthless for the sector. Pretty much, there's some small initiatives here and there to grow them and eat them as meat birds, but they aren't really meat birds, so they don't grow to that size. So you're trying to really flip that on its head and say, what if you have a chicken that does eggs and the males actually grow into an interesting meat bird as well, which would energetically make way more sense simply from efficiency, from feed, from what a system could look like. How difficult do you think that is from the genetics? You're saying actually there's a rise of dual purpose ones. How far or how do you even get to a dual purpose? You're going to test different ones. Is there even a selection now you can pick from, like if you wanted to?
So I guess historically there would have been a lot of dual purpose breeds available in terms of kind of backyard chicken production. When I say there's a rise, I guess there's a rise of more commercial type dual purpose, which is maybe not what we even need to look to. So we're really keen to look beyond obviously just the UK and beyond even Europe. There are genetics in China and other parts of the world that are forming these kind of dual purpose birds. So I think there is some. I think that it's gone from a large variety to then very few, and then I think some of that variety will still be there, but it will be in much smaller numbers. So it's about tapping into some of those as well.
Yeah, and so that's a big lever, let's say, to pull. Like if you can make that on a commercial and the size, of course, you are commercial size, make it work. That would cut out a lot of waste, a lot of inefficiency, a lot of energy and feed. And a lot of course, animal welfare issues. What are other ones? I often hear the feed is a challenge as well to do that in a regenerative way. I mean, the grazing side, of course, you have ruminants. They could be fully pasture fed, and so you're taking the grass, the sunlight, and the water. What is that about chickens? I mean, not the backyard ones where you feed a bit of leftovers and a lot of things, but that's of course completely not commercial. I think Richard Perkins has written and shared about it often, and that he's not the happiest, I think, with chickens, but it's a good commercial product. You can buy the organic grain and doesn't feel super happy about it, but it's a really good driver for margins and for the soil, actually the health of the soil. How do you see that? How important is the feed, and what are you going to research there or try there?
So I think it's there are currently farmers looking at, say, for example, alternatives to soya, which is really important because if there's one of the components of chicken feed that is really causing a lot of damage is soya, both from the deforestation angle for where it's been grown, but also then chickens don't digest phosphate very well, so it ends up with high levels of phosphate in the muck. And we have in the UK only 14% of rivers with good ecological status. That's not totally down to chickens, of course, but there are some rivers where that is a high contributor towards the degradation of our water. And so there's things like alternatives to existing, but again, that sometimes that does feel a little bit like tweaks. So I think what we're really interested in is if we had a bird, and we've got some on the ground at the moment, some from a kind of local farmer who's breeding his own, how do they behave and interact differently with the environment? So they are up and running around, and they are eating seed heads, they're eating insects, and they're behaving in a different way. And that's one thing to look at, is how do we increase the biodiversity that's in our environment so that provides more of the feed. Of course, chickens would eat a mixture of all sorts of things. We've even seen them eat small rodents before. So, they can't just live on grass like cows. So it's how do we bring that in? And waste streams of food are a potential solution. But I think also, like, current modern genetics have grown up side by side with soya. So I think when we unpick the genetic side, we'll be unpicking the feed side at the same time, and working out what works. And also that balance of production. I talked to a friend who's chickens in Kenya, and he says we don't feed them anything, but they only produce an egg a week. So instead of an egg a day, it's an egg a week. What does 5 eggs a week look like, and what does the feed need for that, and how does that what's the true cost, environmentally, ecologically, human, financially, of doing that? And I think that's what we really want to explore, and that's what's not really been picked apart, and that's a really kind of like important part of the project for us.
Yeah, so let's unpack. No, let's first go where you are, Claire, just to give a bit of grounding and context. You mentioned the farm; it's a grazing operation, but just to if we would walk around there, and we would do this as a walking the land episode, which we sometimes do, what would that look like? What should people imagine? Where are you going to experiment? Where are you going to do this research in terms of place?
So yeah, we're a small. Well, I would say small in farming terms. It's 80 acres. Huge, of course, if you live with no garden. So we're a farm in South Shropshire. We're just at the bottom of the Shropshire Hills, which is a natural landscape, and we're only just below the moorland line, which so only 2 fields above us onto common land where it's open, everyone has access, and local farmers graze sheep and cattle and horses communally up there. So we're quite high up. It's quite an upland environment, something that you might imagine maybe kind of Lake District-esque, and we are. We're quite hilly, quite undulating, and most of our land goes down towards a small brook. It's sloping down towards that. The land is all permanent pasture, so all grassland, that's been in grassland for a long time, and it has this feeling of it evolving to be wood pasture. So the previous farmer before us, he was quite old, and he farmed right, like so many do, farmed right up until his 90s. And what that meant was that maybe his accessibility around the farm or use of machinery in the later years was not as much. So we actually have a fairly wild feeling farm. It's not being so well managed, which for some is not good, but for us it's been great, because actually we have got quite a lot of kind of scrub and trees and things in the middle of fields, which maybe we don't have. So it's quite from a farming landscape point of view, it's quite wild in places, and we're building up on that with bringing more trees in to kind of recreate open wood pasture as we think this land would have been.
And that's the home, let's say, of Impeccable Poultry. How would you describe Impeccable Poultry if you had to, like, research project? Is that fair? R&D? Yes and no. What's your not your pitch, but what's your and decide who takes this one, obviously, of Impeccable Poultry, and then we'll unpack it a bit more.
So I think it's both research project initially, but with the view that we will come up with a blueprint, or in regenerative agriculture, we don't do one solution. That's the problem. It's not like every farm must do it like this, but a solution with a number of different options that farmers can, or anybody with land can take and build something on their farm, with the idea that instead of 1 or 2% of farms in the UK having hundreds of thousands of chickens, actually, let's say 30% of farms in the UK have a few hundred chickens, and we spread the benefits of that across the country. And the challenges. But what the reason that it's because we could just take, people know how to do people know how to do pasture poultry. We could just say, let's just scale that right now. But I think with these issues we talk about around breed and feed, what we want to do is really kind of dig into that and resolve those. So how do we get to a point where before we grow it out and spread it out across lots of farms and grow it as a business opportunity for many, then we need to iron out some of these problems around breed, for example, because if we're going to grow a business, we want it to be a business that is truly regenerating, so that as the business scales, it's having a positive impact at every point. Whereas if we scaled the poultry system that we have on the farm here today, we would be scaling some of the problems that go with that. So we don't want to do that. We want to try and iron everything out first, make it a truly regenerative model, and then start to scale it out. But the idea being it's solutions for helping many people move in a more regenerative direction.
And is your thought there that by spreading out the chickens, or let's say integrating more chickens on more farms, that it naturally, of course, this is a very tricky question, will undermine, let's say, the industrialized chicken industry, or will it grow next to it and we'll just produce more chicken with the same amount of issues, at least on the industrial side?
Yeah, I've maybe... So I know Annie wants to say something as well. So I think for me anyway, Annie might have a different view, is that it's almost a totally different product. And so, volume wise, we're not going to displace, but what we provide is an alternative solution. So for farmers wanting to grow that, and for people wanting to eat something that is more nutrient dense and that has contributed positively rather than negatively towards an ecosystem, then it's providing another option on the shelf. And that's the way, for now anyway, that I would see it kind of co-evolving. Yeah,
I can't expect those that potentially purchase impeccable poultry, whatever it is in the future, to be still purchasing commercial chicken. So I expect there will be, or hope there is some level of displacement. But I think what is really key to the project as well is this kind of journey of the citizen and the consumer, or and being able to use poultry or chicken to tell the story of food and get people to try and connect back to food. So I think we envisage we'll probably be selling whole birds, and that comes with some kind of recipe, some kind of way of really connecting with what you're purchasing. So it's not sold, it's unlikely to go into a burger or anything like that. So I think, as Claire says, it's going to be a very different product, and it's going to be trying to achieve a very different thing as well to commercially raised poultry.
It's interesting you keep saying commercially. I would still hope that also these chickens are going to be raised commercially, not
large scale.
Let's say. Yeah, no, I think that's but everybody understands what you mean. It's just my pet peeve that I think this should be done commercially in a way as well. And just staying with you, like, how positive, if you know that I understand from the margin perspective, it's interesting to have eggs, interesting to from a farmer perspective to sell chickens because it's something everybody eats, or many people eat. You don't have to learn how to cook a rabbit or a duck or something like that, which might be way more relevant actually for the land. How positive can chickens be for the land? Is it from a farming and farmer and soil perspective, with the picking, with their feces, of course? Is that an easy bit in terms of regeneration?
So I think we don't know. We don't know the true answer. Nobody's measured it yet, and that's what we want to do, is to understand that, and what's the balance. So on an 80-acre farm, should we have 10 chickens? Should we have 1,000 chickens? Because there'll be a tipping point of where it sits, and that's one thing that we. That's what we really need to understand as part of this process.
And on the genetic side, it sounds really long-term and complex to figure out, okay, which dual-purpose genetics are even out there, which might work in our context, etc. Do you have, how would it even work? Let's say you get the funding, because that's what you're looking for, of course, partners, funding, etc., to kick off Impeccable Poultry. In terms of timeline, when should we expect, or what are timelines looking like for this kind of genetics research to figure out something that you can then safely, but of course with certain conditions, but say, okay, we have at least an idea of a blueprint or an idea of this genetics works in this context. So at least with our neighbors, we can have a conversation or something like that. What is that a 10, 15, 20 year, 2 year? What kind of timelines are we talking here?
I think it's always going to be an evolution, isn't it? So there's a kind of an eye on continuous progress and making that improvement. And as the world is, you're not going to put something out there that then is never going to change. So I think in terms of the blueprint, we can get to a point where we can be much more certain than we currently are, and that will be hopefully two years or so.
Because chickens are relatively fast as well. It's not like cow or other ruminants where it might take years. Like in terms of chicken, I'm imagining it might be a faster cycle to improve, to see, to select, to observe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are quite a few genetics out there, so that there's opportunity to bring.
How do you find them? Do you go around like in backyards? Or how do you look for chicken genetics?
Well, so we've got quite a lot of contacts from. In Europe, there's a company that are evolving a dual-purpose bird. So we've got contacts from work over there, and then again, we've got quite a few contacts in China too that we're hoping to look at. I think there's obviously going to be issues trying to import genetics and such like, but I think it's about finding them, and then they tend to emerge as well. So again, through our contact that we've had, the current dual purpose, he's an amazing person and has been kind of tapped into the world of chicken genetics since he was a really young boy. So they're out there, and they're very keen as well quite often.
Yeah, because how unique is this in terms of real on-farm deployment, like embedding of dual purpose, etc., in the rest of the world? Like how should we rate this on the uniqueness scale?
I think the dual purpose, it's really unique in the UK, but it's not so unique globally, definitely, because the kind of backyard, small scale-ish production for family groups within Asia is really commonplace. People will have chickens in order to feed their families. So it's unique within the kind of UK context, definitely, but less unique globally. I guess the uniqueness comes from Impeccable in terms of trying to enable farmers to do that kind of within our current agricultural framework that we have, that we need to evolve. That's where the uniqueness comes. So how can we put more chickens onto more farms in a way that, as Claire says, is really environmentally beneficial and also good for the birds.
Yeah, because having 10 birds in your backyard compared to maybe 1,000 on a farm is a fundamentally different, plus raising them commercially or raising them for margins instead of hoping to have, if you have 7 eggs in the morning or 5, it doesn't really matter in your backyard. But of course, these numbers matter a lot in terms of when you start integrating them in other people's farm, also in yours, but in other people's farm. And then on the feed side, what are you looking at? What do you think? What would you love to try? What are you what is on your list basically in terms of feed developments or feed alternatives or feed research that you would love to tackle first?
Yeah, he's going to go first. So what one thing that's really interesting that strikes me already is just the volume of feed that the dual purpose birds that we've got on the ground at the moment are even eating. So they seem to be eating a lot less of the kind of the normal classic feed. So there's just some of those kind of for me it's even just starting with that observation, but then Annie's probably going to talk about some of the more interesting things that we might look at with feed. Well, we have done some experimenting with what we have done on the farm is we've experimented with sprouting grains. We've experimented with fermenting
then
feed.
Kittredge will be very happy.
Yeah. So we've done that, and again, it's that, and I think maybe maybe most that do it, we do it at a level that works within firstly, it works for us because we're dedicated to wanting to do it, but we haven't yet found like, oh, this works really well and it's really easy. It doesn't come with ease almost, and we can see the benefit in the birds when we do it, but it's quite a lot of work. So there's solutions that's still to be looked at around how to do that and the right balance of it and how beneficial is it. So I think we know that those things do help, but do they help with the amount of cost and effort that there is at the moment? And some innovation is needed, I think, in how do you deliver fermented feed regularly to birds in a way that's not a lot of work, because then it just won't happen, particularly when we're talking about integrating poultry as an enterprise onto another farm. That's one of the reasons that why isn't everybody doing it already, is because that expertise doesn't exist. So we want to make that as kind of do that research. That's why it's a research thing now, to figure out how to do that to make it easy for others.
I think it's not just expertise, isn't it, that makes it, that is a barrier to it being across multiple farms. There's kind of economies of scales and things like that we want to start to explore. So how can we, bulk purchase grains for sprouting or such in a way that then makes it much more economically viable for other farmers too. So it's not just kind of the absolute feed that they're being fed, but the kind of everything that surrounds that and how to get that to the birds and in a way that's viable ultimately.
Yeah, because it sounds, to think of biochar or something, it sounds like every farmer should do that. You can probably Google and YouTube your way into a sort of recipe, but most are a really good compost, but most farmers won't because of a whole range of reasons. Like it's not that easy to build a Johnson & Sue compost or whatever compost system you're using. You could, but you need to spend the time and energy that you cannot spend elsewhere to do so. And I think, sprouting grain sounds a bit in the similar area. You could do it yourself, but if somebody doesn't only deliver you the genetics or the chickens, but also if you figured out that it makes it's worth the effort and the money to use sprouting, then if somebody also sells you that feed directly, or a really easy recipe or a really easy method or machine or whatever setup that you can use, because we just know it's not going to happen otherwise, because it's thing number 10 on your to-do list, and it will just not, unless it's really magical for birds. But none of this is magical, it's all incremental. And so where are you now in terms of, we're recording this in the middle of 2024. What is the current status? You said we have some birds on the land. What would you describe the current status of impeccable poultry?
I think we're at the pre-pilots almost. we're playing with the resources that we currently have, and really wishing to kind of get it kind of really kick-started in terms of funding for time and designing houses and doing it at a much kind of faster pace, I guess. So we have a very small kind of chicken group, I guess, at the moment to try and explore or start to kind of get to know some dual purpose genetics at the moment. But definitely at the pre-pilot stage, or pilot maybe.
And what do you think investors, I think there's starting to become a bit of excitement around chickens again, but then a different kind of chicken and eggs, some from the health side of things, so for the diet side, some from the role it could play in farmer finance, etc. It feels also very early in that. And we've seen a few companies, I think Vital Farms in the US, Pasture Bird, which we interviewed, which I'll link below, Tree Range, which we interviewed and invested in actually with our syndicate, are also exploring on a different scale, different angle, but definitely putting the chicken in many cases first and being very vocal about it, which I think we need, and very vocal about the issues of the current chicken. We didn't really talk about that, but the current chicken industry. Go and Google, I think, is the first thing. Go and be ready for the most horrible videos you will see. I think we see more and more people waking up to that kind of, like, it's a completely different product, like you said, Claire. But let's say we do this in a theater. I like to ask that question, and the room is full of people that want to put money to work, or either their own money or other people's money, what would you tell them? Of course, get in touch if you can grant or donate or you can partner. But from an investment point of view, what should investors know about the chicken industry now and the potential of Regen? What would be something you like to plant? What kind of seed would you like to plant in their mind if you could?
That's a good that's a good question. I think it is just I think chicken is one of those it's really unknown about the multiple problems that it has. It's such an everyday feature in a British diet that we kind of assume that it's all good. Actually, it is inherent with problems and globally impacting problems as well. So I think it's firstly just kind of understanding that anything that is contributing towards, when we're supporting anything in that way of chicken, is just being awake to what we're doing. And it's okay to be working in that system, but being really awake to what's happening, and that the nutrient density of that food is not so great. I think the other thing for investors or people thinking about chickens to know is just maybe the chicken industry globally is quite centrally controlled, and we include the genetics in that. So people might talk about different, I've got Highline or I've got Lohmann Brown, but ultimately two corporate companies own all of the laying hen, or majority of the laying hen genetics globally, and another two that own all of the broilers. And then they are connected to, or the same companies as the feed, and the farms and everything. So just a kind of, when we often think of a farm, we imagine a family farm as it is, and it's all kind of independent. So even where people might be independent, still very reliant on a centrally controlled system. And that is something that feels like in this more ever-changing world that we need more diversity, don't they say? I don't know what the question was, but the answer was always diversity. So we don't have diversity in our chicken sheds, in our birds, and in the companies that control our chicken system. And I think that's something to just is kind of goes under the radar. I don't think many people are aware of that, and just having an awakening of that to then think, okay, I'm okay with that, and that's going to carry on, or actually maybe I want to contribute, particularly as it's a product that so many people eat. It meets so many requirements of nutritionally of people, or it can when it's done well, and like you say, it's quite a quick turnaround and things like that. It's as a food source, it's very adaptable and very good. And but yeah, maybe the way we're doing it at the moment, I don't think most people realise maybe the degradation that's contributing to in human health, ecological health, and the birds are not having a great time. That's the centre to all of this for Annie and I, is that everybody often doesn't talk about that. The birds are not having a good life in those systems, and we need to know that and try, if we can, to choose to do it differently.
Yeah, there's a great slide in your deck, or a great slide, the current state of chicken, which shares a number of headlines from the River Wye pollution coming from a chicken farm that's now being sued. Of course, poison poultry, the antibiotics use, which 3 major supermarkets in the UK still source antibiotic-treated chicken connected to salmonella, deforestation in Brazil, bird flu detected in a person. Like you can see, and these are just 5-6 headlines, you can see how far we pushed a system which somehow makes a CAFO operation looks like I'm not saying paradise, but like these large pictures we know of these animals, or the ruminants in the US, etc., and other places, like no grass, they're getting feed soy, etc. That makes this look like a holiday, basically. Like the chicken operations are on a whole different scale in terms of concentration, in terms of issues, in terms of death, and in terms of animal welfare and human health as well. I mean, the fact that bird flu could travel to a human should wake people up, but I don't think we see enough of those headlines. Somehow chicken is just not really talked about compared to some other, and then we didn't even talk about the slaughtering and the monopolies or oligopolies that you mentioned before. So it's safe to say we need some diversity. Maybe that's a good message for stage there. And what would you do? We like to ask this question to flip the question, and I'm very curious about both of your answers, obviously. If you had a lot of money to put to work, maybe a bit in grant funding, but actually quite a bit in investment money, which could be extremely long-term. So it doesn't have to be a 10-year, it could be long-term investments. probably the chicken side, but you could, or poultry, but you could choose something else. Like if both of you had to put £1 billion to work, pound sterling, what would you do? What would be the big buckets you focus on? I don't need exact amounts, but just, okay, I would really focus on X, Y, Z, and break it down. Let's say if you had to, from one day to another, put that amount of money to work.
I think Regen is asking a lot from a lot of people. I think in terms of the skill sets people need to develop, they need to be able to sell their produce, they need to be able to have multiple enterprises and all of these things. So I think if I was to have investment to put somewhere, I put it towards kind of really practical solutions that can make farmers' lives easier. So be that kind of the formation of co-ops or buying groups, or potentially having roaming managers that can help assist on enterprises across multiple farms. I think trying to make people's lives less complex, because that's what we want to do as humans, right? But allow for that complexity in terms of what we're doing with our farming systems.
So how to enable farm managers or land stewards to complexify without giving them a burnout of 20 different enterprises and roaming manager. Very interesting answer. And it's like we ask them to complexify and then are surprised when it doesn't work, because it's just too much for a single, our ideal image of a single family farm that does everything and sells on the farmer's market and does their own butchering or whatever. That's probably not reality for most, and maybe we shouldn't want that. But how do you combine? Because there's a reason why we used to do this together, and not just on the single farm. And what about you, Claire? Well, you can get as an answer for the magic wand question, which I was going to ask after. So what would you do if you had a magic wand to change something overnight? That could be that one. But if you had to put money to work, then what would you do with that?
Yeah, it would be in a similar way to Annie. It's in the people. So what we see is so it may be more investment. We see a lot of people want to invest in tech because it's a tangible thing. We can see it growing, but actually what we need is increased eco-literacy, increased ability to manage complexity on the land, a help in unpicking some of the cultural norms that have led us to believe that, it's only good if it's controlled and it looks neat. Those things are what we need support with. So it's kind of like equal focus on people and on technology. The fifth agricultural revolution is said to be a combination of one that will be technology and agroecology together. So we need equal investment going into the agroecology side as we see going into the tech side to help some of these things. To help us. It's ultimately it's people, isn't it? That's what we need. We're the ones that will act the change. And most of us want to see a positive change. We just don't always have the tools or the knowledge to do it. And because societally we've grown up in a mechanistic way and we've been taught at agriculture college to do things in a certain way. And it's quite hard to unpick that. So that's what I would like to see. Yeah. Investment in equal balance of agroecology and in technology. Because at the moment it feels like it's tipped more in the tech side of things.
Definitely, yeah. The amount of money flowing to tech is quite staggering. And then the natural bridge to the magic wand one, which you partly already answered, but maybe you want to unpack a bit more. If you could change one thing overnight, what would it be?
A move from GDP being a measure of success, both at national and international level, but also down as just like financial success being the only thing that's success, regarded as success, because it's leading to the extractive way in which we operate, and actually people, so maybe people are making money and everyone's unhappy. So a health score. The other thing, if I could have two magic wands, would be to merge food, health, agriculture as one governmental unit, while health and agriculture sit separately. We have this kind of one thing doing one thing negatively or positive is affecting on the other negatively. And those two things can't be looked at in isolation. So that would be my magic wand, to get some strategic change at that level, because most people don't want to live in this world that is so dominated by finance being the only measure, but somehow we're scared to speak up about that. Or there's challenges when you set up a limited company, for example, in the articles of association, or it is a requirement that you are always acting for the financial profitability of the business. Nothing's in there about the people or the ecology or the animals within that. And that's that sort of egocentric through to ecocentric is the change that we need to see.
And what about you, Annie? If you had the magic power to change one thing, and really one, I mean, most people end up saying one or two, but what would it be for you?
I think in a similar vein, I guess Claire and I talk a lot. It would be along the kind of true cost or true price paid. So food, I guess, within the context of food, that you're not just paying. All those costs aren't then externalized. So true cost accounting for whatever you're paying. So I guess we've having conversation earlier around the cost of impeccable chicken, and actually the fact that you can buy chicken for, I don't know, £3 or something mad in a supermarket, that shouldn't even be possible, so that people don't have those options, and that cost shouldn't be externalized to the kind of soy production and rainforests and all of the things outside of what you're what you're actually buying. But obviously then I guess linking nicely into Claire's one, it does need to link into the kind of affordability, and people need to be able to eat, and it shouldn't just be for the people that can afford more expensive protein sources. But yeah, a general world change. I think that's what my magic wand.
A magic wand would do. Yeah. And to wrap it up, in terms of chicken, when you talk to people, what's the one thing you would like them to know? What's the biggest surprise around chickens that people, even in the regen space, don't really normally know? Like when you realize, like, okay, this is something that people should really know or normally don't realize when it comes to chickens. What comes to mind in terms of stories, examples, etc., from working so much with poultry, both of you?
I mean, at the most basic level, that there is two different types of chicken that lay eggs and the ones that you eat. That I think that's just highlights the disconnect between people and food. So yeah, that's a slightly mad one. I think the amount of mortality associated within meat production, like we account for when placing birds at large numbers, they account for that mortality to happen. So they're expecting 3, 4, 5% of those birds to die. So I think really kind of back to our kind of starting point of welfare. I think the welfare issues associated particularly with both meat and egg production are really quite surprising to people when you talk to them.
Yeah, basically you're planning in trying to remove them as well sometimes, and not always managing to lose up to 5% or more birds, which is shocking, because that means that the other 95 are not doing so well either. If 5% is calculated to lose it, that's okay. Or 3 or 4, I mean, it doesn't make a big difference, honestly. And what about you, Claire? What is your go-to chicken story for shocking or surprising or delighting people?
Yeah. I think maybe the thing that's coming up as you ask the question, that it's not something we've mentioned, but would be often in the debate about should we eat meat, shouldn't we eat meat, good for the environment, bad for the environment, is that, chicken's good because when we look at it through some carbon lenses, it can look better. And often
feed in, feed out, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so so maybe the efficiency of feed consumed is great, but all of the nutrient density of the food, the life that the animals have had, they're not meant to waddle very slowly from one point to another before sitting down again. They're actually meant to be out and running around. And then when they are sitting down, they're in pain. So I think there's quite a lot of unknowns about it. But the one thing would be this kind of like opening our eyes up to the narrative that chicken is better for the environment because of feed efficiency, when actually there is, when you look at the whole spectrum of different impacts, Annie's point about the true cost, if we included the true cost to our health, to the animal's health and to our environment, then chicken isn't a pretty picture.
I think it's a good way or good moment to wrap up. And I want to thank you, first of all, so much for the work you do and coming on here in an early phase to share. I think it's a very important moment to put a spotlight on it as well, even though you're just, I mean, not meaning just, but air quotes, but you're getting started with Impeccable Poultry, of course, building upon so much of the work you've done before. And I really look forward to following it over time and see what role chicken can play. Maybe the conclusion is it can't, and it will be geese or in some other form. But let's imagine there is a role, and how do you integrate more complexity without giving farmers burnout, I think is a good starting point and a good question to ask. And what's the counter narrative to the industrialized chicken, which is a sentence I really like from your deck. So thank you so much for coming on here and to share about it, and absolutely keep us posted.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time.